Hello, everyone. Welcome to the webinar Climate Crisis, Adaptation and Resilience. I am Rocío Cortés Rodríguez from the Pontifical Catholic University of Chile, and I will be the moderator for the webinar today. This webinar is the final of a series of 3 webinars that has been taking place over the last 6 months. The overreaching title is Integral Ecology and the Future of the Planet, Interdisciplinary Conversations. The idea of our meeting today is to address the following premise. In the context of the climate crisis, what are the main challenges for adaptation and resilience? This webinar is organized by the Strategic Alliance of Catholic Research Universities, Sacru, which is composed of 8 institutions: the Catholic University of Australia, Boston College, the United States, the Pontifical Catholic University of Chile, the Pontifical Catholic University of Rio de Janeiro, Brazil, Sophia University, Japan, the Catholic University of Portugal, Sacro Cuore University, Italy, and Ramon Llull University, Spain. In this opportunity, the webinar is also led by the Sustainable Development Institute of the Catholic University of Chile. During the seminar, it will be available simultaneous translation from English into Spanish. If you need it, please feel free to enter the correct room pressing the globe that is at the bottom of the screen and says interpretation. Durante el seminario dispondremos de interpretación simultánea del inglés al español. Si lo necesita, por favor, no dude en entrar en la sala correcta pulsando el globo terráqueo que dice abajo interpretación. Es un globo, un circulito, en la parte inferior de la pantalla. Our plan for today. We have an exciting agenda planned for you today. We'll be starting with the opening words of Francisco Gallego, Director of the Institute for Sustainable Development of the Pontifical Catholic University of Chile. After that, we will show you some videos made by 5 universities that are part of Sacru. Next, we will welcome our 2 guest speakers, María Lemos and Francisco Mesa. I will tell you about them later today. Each of them will share for about 15 minutes their insights on the question, what are the main challenges for adaptation and resilience? Later, we will be hosting a Q&A session with the speakers. This is a great opportunity for you to ask any questions you may have and engage in a discussion with our speakers. You can do so by using the chat function during the presentations or even now, so we can collect them during the session and then we will pass them to our speakers. Finally, we will end our event with some closing remarks. Overall, we hope that you will find today's event informative and engaging. We encourage you to participate actively and take advantage of this opportunity to learn from our expert speakers. Thank you for joining us, and let's get started. So our first speaker is Francisco Gallego. We welcome to Francisco, Director for the Sustainable Development Institute of the Pontifical Catholic University of Chile. Thank you, Francisco.
Thank you very much, Rocío. So I would like, good morning, good afternoon, and good evening. We have people from very different places in the world. So I want to extend a very warm welcome to all of you, the people that are joining us today from around the world. I am the director of the Institute for Sustainable Development. I wanted to mention that this is a new interdisciplinary academic unit at UC Chile, at the Catholic University of Chile, dedicated to research, teaching, and outreach in sustainability. In the Institute, we work in advancing sustainability both inside and outside the classroom. Last year alone, we offered several undergraduate graduate and extension courses that were attended by more than 1,500 students at UC Chile. In addition, we are working actively in research projects and dedicated to disseminating scientific knowledge related to sustainability. We are also working closely with communities, NGOs, and the government in Chile to implement practical solutions that might have a positive impact on the society. And importantly, our efforts have not been limited to the borders of Chile. We are proud to have established several international collaborations to further advance our efforts towards a more sustainable world. And this webinar is part of this effort to generate and join a global conversation on the challenges of sustainability. Today's webinar, as Rocio mentioned before, is focused on climate crisis, adaptations, and resilience, which is like a pressing issue in the field of sustainability. We are excited to have Fernanda and Francisco, two leading experts from two Sacru universities from the South in Latin America. And we also will have like several videos presenting the views of students from different universities, from different continents, and actually in different languages. I believe that this webinar actually is not only like a very like a valuable platform, but also, and the other webinars of the Sacru webinars also show like innovative approaches that we can use to address the sustainability challenges. In particular, we have like a platform for diverse perspectives, and this webinar highlights like the need for collective action and bring us one step closer to finding meaningful solutions to the sustainability issue. So thanks again for joining us and contributing to this important conversation. Thank you.
Thank you, Francisco, for your words. Now we will give space also to watch the announced videos that we are expecting from the students of 5 universities that are part of Sacru, so we can watch it before we welcome our speakers. Thank you.
Minasan, konnichiwa. 上智大学 SPSF 人間総合学部教育学科1年中村育です。気候変動、それはまさに世界全体が共有する問題、グローバルイシューです。日本も例外ではなく、気候変動を助長させ、そして同時に被害を受けています。日本は他の先進国と同じように、大量の二酸化炭素の排出を常に行いながら、洪水や台風などの自然災害によって多くの方を失っています。フランシスコ教皇によるラウダト詩には、人間の自然への認識の問題、大量生産・消費の問題、正義・公正の問題など、気候変動における根本的な人間性の問題を問うています。ここから受け取れるのは、気候変動との戦いは、私たち人間性の戦いでもあるということです。私たちが人間としてどういう素質を持つのかが、日々の具体的な選択と行動に変化を与えます。確かに、日本でも様々な気候変動に対する政策や法律が提案され、整備されてきています。しかし、現状を最終的に変えるのは、紙に書かれた言葉でも、それに関わる政治決定者でもありません。1億人を超える日本人、そして何十億人という世界の一人一人の選択と行動です。そして、その選択と行動を本当に支えているのは、その人が持つ人間としての質ではないでしょうか。人間としてどんな素質、価値、倫理性を持ちたいのか、私も自分自身、社会、世界に問い続けていきたいと思います。
Olá, o meu nome é Alexandra Freire e sou aluna de Direito e Gestão da Universidade Católica Portugesa, no Porto. Em janeiro de 2023, quase 85% da eletricidade gerada em Portugal continental teve origem renovável, sendo Portugal o quarto país da União Europeia com maior consumo de eletricidade verde. No entanto, isto não é suficiente. Portugal é também dos países europeus com maior vulnerabilidade aos impactos das alterações climáticas. Nos últimos anos, o nível do mar tem subido, os incêndios alastrado mais depressa, as ondas de calor têm sido mais intensas e 2022 foi o pior ano de seca desde que há registro. As alterações climáticas são sentidas à escala global, são um problema global e necessitam de uma solução global, a transição energética. A transição energética não só é necessária, como é uma oportunidade de mercado. Os países que criarem grandes empresas e toda uma indústria de energia limpa, mostrando que essas soluções podem ser aplicadas à escala global e de forma financeiramente acessível, serão os líderes da economia global nas próximas décadas. Eu tenho uma visão otimista do assunto. É verdade que estamos numa corrida contra o tempo para evitar um desastre climático. No entanto, se todos e cada um de nós, cidadãos e consumidores do mundo, entendermos a urgência e o impacto da nossa ação climática e se formos resilientes e, acima de tudo, exigentes, iremos conseguir mudar mais rápida e concertadamente a forma como consumimos e produzimos energia, a forma como os governos e as empresas atuam. Assim, com a cooperação de todos, pessoas, empresas e governos, conseguiríamos atingir a neutralidade carbónica sem comprometer a economia global. Obrigada pela vossa atenção.
Hola, soy Catalina, soy estudiante de tercer año de Derecho en la Pontificia Universidad Católica de Chile. Fui representante de mi universidad, la COP28, y creo que frente a la situación ambiental que enfrentamos los diferentes países, sobre todo en el sur global, es fundamental tomar acción. Yo crecí en la parte rural de Curicó, una pequeña ciudad al centro-sur de Chile, y por muchos años hemos visto cómo la sequía principalmente ha afectado a las comunidades rurales, a mi comunidad en la que yo crecí, a todos mis vecinos, incluso a mi familia, que se ha dedicado por muchos años al sector agropecuario. Y falta mucha acción y mucha conciencia respecto a cómo nosotros en el sur global somos los países y las comunidades más afectadas por la crisis climática, pero no hay quienes hemos causado esta situación. Así que les invito a reflexionar sobre el tema, que hablemos sobre desigualdad, sobre injusticia, que tenemos acción de manera interseccional para hablar de justicia ambiental, justicia social, justicia de género, justicia racial, justicia económica y sobre todo justicia climática.
Hello, my name is Gabriela Guerra, and I'm an alum from Boston College, where I obtained my bachelor in biology and a minor in global public health and the common good. As a medical student in Puerto Rico, I have seen firsthand the detrimental effects of natural disasters and their continued worsening because of climate change. Therefore, when I hear the term climate change, I not only think of its definition as the shifts in weather patterns caused by nature and mostly human activities, but additionally, I think of rising sea levels and how it submerges mangroves, erodes beaches, and exacerbates flooding, causing severe impacts for the coastal communities in Puerto Rico. Furthermore, the driving force of climate change in causing stronger hurricanes and spontaneous fires, which not only affect agriculture, but also affect those with respiratory diseases, making them more susceptible to heat and pollution-related illnesses. I'm concerned that we're running out of time to improve the damage that has been done and to prevent it from worsening in the future. I encourage all of us to have climate change present in our everyday decisions, like our methods of transportation, the foods we consume, and also to actively engage in community efforts to reduce pollution. We must also keep this in mind when making crucial decisions like choosing our leaders and those in positions of power that can alter the course of our future by making meaningful policies and leading by example. Each one of us can also serve as examples to our own communities.
Oi, eu me chamo Isadora. Atualmente sou aluna de mestrado no Departamento de Geografia do PUC Rio e exerço pesquisas voltadas para a área da morfologia costera. Bom, de acordo com o último relatório desenvolvido pelo IPCC, no ano de 2022, estima-se que até 2050 o nível do mar cresça entre 20 a 30 centímetros, prejudicando diretamente os ecossistemas costeiros, bem como trazendo uma consequência em população local das áreas costeiras. E, diante do litoral densamente ocupado, o que eles conseguem perceber são estruturas de engenharia de contenção, por exemplo, de frear o avanço do nível do mar, bem como as ondas tempestais. E o que se percebe é que, muitas vezes, essas obras não protegem, não contêm avanço e sim trazem mais prejuízos ao litoral, bem como as moradias e, consequentemente, os moradores da população costeira. No Rio de Janeiro, a gente também consegue perceber essas obras e também perceber os impactos, que muitas das vezes são noticiados e muitas das vezes também atrapalham a dinâmica costeira. E o que os gestores costeiros propõem como solução a essas obras de contenção rígidas são soluções voltadas para o meio ambiente, como, por exemplo, a preservação e o aumento dos ecossistemas costeiros que servem como amortecimentos naturais.
Students have raised important issues and concerns about the topic of our webinar today. Feel free to add questions related to the videos as well using the chat function. So we will collect the questions, your questions, and we will pass them to the speakers so we can discuss them later today. Now we will start with the presentations of our guest speakers, starting with María Fernanda Lemos. Thank you, María Fernanda, for joining us today. María Fernanda is a professor of urban design and planning in the Pontifical Catholic University of Rio de Janeiro, Brazil. María Fernanda is also coordinator of PUC Rio's Interdisciplinary Center for the Environment and IPCC's coordinator of an author coordinator of the Central and South American chapter of Working Group 2. María Fernanda, thank you for joining us, and the floor is yours. You have to, yeah.
Yeah, that's right. Good afternoon, everyone. First, thank you for the invite, and thank you for all my colleagues at Sacru. Thank you, Rocio, Francisco Galego, and it's a great pleasure to share the table with you, Francisco Meza. And well, I will share my screen here. Just a second. Okay. Can you see?
Yes.
Okay, so I think it's actually very important for us to discuss here in this network an issue as urgent as our ability to face the climate crisis, and especially to strengthen interinstitutional ties that can help us to cooperate, to share good practices, to share experiences and improve our individual capacity to adapt through this exchange with other groups and other places. Let me see if I can do this here. Sorry, just a second to see how I can move on these slides. Yeah. Sorry. Is that okay? The slide is there, the second one. So according to the guidance I received to prepare for this conversation here today, I brought you a brief presentation that focus on what would be the main challenge for tackling the climate crisis. And to do that, I focused on my expertise area, that is the Latin American cities. Actually, I'm an urban designer, urban planning, and so I'm an expert on cities, and I have been focusing on Latin American cities for the last 5 years. So I'll try to contribute with this focus to the discussion. I'm going to start by showing here a very emblematic situation. Sorry, I have a little problem here. Okay, I guess it's solved. Which is a little bit old. It's from 2010, but which it's very appropriate for my argument here today. The disaster images that you are seeing here on the screen refers to the event in a place called Mundo. It's in metropolitan region of Rio de Janeiro. It's in the city called Niterói, where a very poor informal settlement began to emerge in an area that is not only steep terrain, but also a large garbage dump, old and decommissioned. And then many researchers and technicians had been alerting the local government of the risk situation in which the settlement was found, and that the disaster there would be inevitable if people were not relocated. Nothing was made, and then in 2010, when a heavy rain hit the area, the houses slid along with the land, and 48 people died, in addition to many other losses. And then we could see, when the houses slid, the remains of the garbage under the house. So it's not just about occupying a risk area, which happens recurrently, okay, because our cities have absurd housing deficits, and people without financial resources end up to, having to no option but occupying these areas that have no real estate value. But it's literally about people living on top of garbage. It's a condition of precariousness that I have no words to describe. So it's not being easy. Just a second, please, because I'm having trouble to change the slides here. Yes, so okay, and of course, the expected impact of climate change are not just like this. This is so easy to see, and with such immediate damage, there are also impacts that are much more difficult to identify and perceive. For example, those on economic activities, water, or biodiversity, because in this case, the loss occur over time, little by little, and then in a medium or long term, when we see the losses add up and turn it into a complete degradation, by the time we see it, it will be too late. So the impacts on water, biodiversity, etc., are less evident. But just as it takes longer for a definitive loss to occur, it takes longer to rebuild. So if, for example, a certain place has its economy based on an activity that is being impacted from year to year and suddenly becomes unfeasible, the losses in that place can be simply irreversible. So on the other hand, the direct impacts of rains on cities, and in the case I showed you before, although it's easy to solve, lead to immediate deaths, for example, and always or almost always deaths of the poorest. So and also here I get to the point where I wanted, and why I started this presentation with Bumba disaster. The reason why we are in such a severe risk situation in Latin America and in developing countries with some a lot of common characteristics. Of course, we have specific situation in each developing country, but we have also a lot of bad conditions we share, unfortunately. So the reason why is exactly inequality. So it applies for most unwealthy countries, as I said. And inequality reflects negatively on all sectors of urban systems that seems to be impacted by climate change. High levels of socioeconomic inequality, for example, lead to high levels of precariousness in housing. And precariousness in housing is one of the main vulnerability factors in the built environment. But it's not only that. High levels of socioeconomic inequality leads to high levels of injustice in the distribution of infrastructure investments in cities and in the distribution of risks as a result. Furthermore, it's much more complicated to secure inequality investments in areas that depend completely on government support, that areas where people can pay for adaptation or pay indirectly by their urban taxes, for example. Then I want to draw attention here to the fact that while we maintain this level of inequality and maintain the unfair way in which we distribute the resources to face climate change, for example, the more we will increase the distance, of course, between rich and poor. And the risk of climate change falling on the poor will increase inequality. And increasing inequality will in turn increase the risk on the poorest. So it's a vicious circle. I don't know if I can translate because it's something that we say in Portuguese, but I guess you understand. One is feeding the other. So our main challenge to face climate crisis in Latin American regions, in most of developing countries, in cities, is exactly facing inequality, to reduce it and bringing justice to the allocation and distribution of investments and solutions. As you may know, to adapt is to reduce vulnerability, and to reduce vulnerability is to increase resilience. So vulnerability and urban, economic, ecological, has its own causes of vulnerability, and it's always something site-specific.
Maria? Sorry for interrupting you, but we cannot see very well the slides. So maybe if you click on the presentation option of your PowerPoint, we will be able to see the charts a little bit larger.
Okay, I guess.
Go to the bottom maybe of the PowerPoint, and then you will see.
Yeah, I guess I cannot do this.
Okay, okay, don't worry then. Don't worry.
Sorry.
No, no worries, no worries. Thank you.
Let me see where I was. Okay. So in order to know our vulnerability, it's not enough to understand, for example, the sensitivity of the built physical system, such as extreme land impermeabilization, undersizing of the rainwater drainage system, the precariousness of buildings, but also it's necessary to know the sensibility of the social structure, the productive dynamics, and cultural limits to welcome, for example, certain transformations that maybe can be necessary in consumption patterns, for example. And besides, this whole universe of informality that characterizes the cities in many developing countries is a system that is very difficult to understand and to act over it without creating certain ruptures, for example, in the social nets, which would make adaptation initiative to become an action with unforeseen negative effects. And it's what we call maladaptation. That's something that we could discuss a bit more later. But in summary, I would say that the main obstacles for adaptation in cities in developing countries, and particularly in Latin America, are related to inequality per se, but also its effects on the territory, which determine a high degree of vulnerability in cities. And the effect on the territory will be characterized by presence of large pockets of poverty, informality, housing precariousness, occupation of risk areas, territorial physical segregation, poor distribution of infrastructure and equipment across the territory, deficiencies in public transport system, and all this is still added by a very fragile governance system, which is the second major obstacle to address resilience in my perception. And it's characterized by, for example, non-inclusive decision-making processes, social groups completely excluded from decision-making, lack of transparency in decision, deficiency in risk communication, deficiencies in follow-up systems mapping control of the results of actions, absence of long-term planning, that I guess is one of the most important things here. And another group of obstacles refers to lack of knowledge, either over the problem and over the solution. Little research is still done in the region as a result. And as a result of this, we still have many knowledge gaps that are decisive obstacles, knowledge gaps in climate hazards at local scale, knowledge gaps in vulnerabilities, in impacts prediction, and in solutions effectiveness for each local vulnerability. Also very relevant in the challenge is the challenge of financing the adaptation, and it's relevant all over the world, but particularly severe in developing countries. And finally, I would cite another obstacle, which is actually something that is delaying the building of resilience and thus making the problem bigger and harder to face, that is inaction itself. We are not adopting the precautionary principle to implement anticipatory adaptation solutions. We are not preparing our cities to receive the impacts that are to come. Adaptation should always be anticipatory rather than reactive. And this is serious because the longer we delay adaptation, the greater the problem becomes, as vulnerability continues to grow in the pattern of urban and economic development that we have today. Anyway, I know that this is somewhat pessimistic message, can seem like that, but scientists today generally agree that there is still time to move into a climate resilient development, way of development, and improve our resilience condition to face the impacts that are to come. But as I said, as much as we delay action, the more difficult it will be to build this condition of resilience. So, thank you very much. I now open to questions and discussions. Of course, we could discuss this for a lot of time. And I hope I have contributed to the debate. And thank you again.
Thank you, Maria Fernanda, for your wonderful presentation. Remember that you can use the chat function for your questions. We are already collecting them, and we will pass them to our speakers later during the Q&A session. Now we will give the possibility to speak to Francisco Mesa. Francisco is a professor of the Faculty of Agronomy and Forestry Engineering. He's also part of the Center for Global Change at the Pontifical Catholic University of Chile. His areas of expertise are climate change on agriculture, global change, applied climatology, impacts and adaptation of variability and water resources. Thank you, Professor Francisco, for being with us today. You can start now.
Thanks so much, Rocio, for this kind introduction. And I like the possibility to speak along with Maria Fernanda. Hopefully, this will be a complementary talk by sharing the screen. And you can tell me whether available for all of.
We cannot, now we see it. Perfect, thank you.
Great. Okay, so I did a presentation that is going to be delivered in English, but the slides are in vast majority in Spanish. That would be a bit easier to follow. Our knowledge is still too much focus on impacts and diagnostics mode. This is the cover, the front page of the statement that climate change happening already, and the impacts are becoming increasingly intensive, and they don't have any comparison to previous years, and they are across the CARES, of course. I would say that the IPCC report came out in a very difficult moment for humankind. We were under the most dark days of the pandemic event, so the possibility for the discussion of these findings was a little bit constrained, and even more so if you consider that the IPCC report on adaptation, precisely the after the invasion of Ukraine. So the attention of the public and the media was dedicated to geopolitical, and impacts of that. Climate change is occurring. It is clear that CO2 is rising rapidly. And along with that, in the future, we see that by any increase in carbon dioxide in the atmosphere, the impacts on climate will be coming along, and they will probably most importantly by the disadvantaged members of the society. We know that the climate is experiencing a change, and it's a warming trend that has not comparison in more than 2,000 years, and perhaps we need to extend our climate record back to 400,000 years in order to see something that is at least a bit comparable with the observations that we're having. And the events of climate change, the impacts of climate change in terms of warming trends, hot extremes, droughts, and increasing in heavy precipitation are felt along the globe. So the question here is, what do we do in order to increase our adaptation capacities? This figure I'm showing right now depicts something in a very innovative way. This is our climate in Chile from latitudes 30 to 40, and here we have different years. The last 40 years are represented here, and we see that there is this window that is, of course, the most important drought. Is called the mega drought, and it represents by itself an experiment that we are observing right now, and we need to learn a lot about impacts and, of course, actions for future adaptation. The climate in the future doesn't look promising. There is a big difference between increasing 1.5 degrees of warming in comparison to 40. Every degree is relevant, and the impacts of climate change are not necessarily proportional. So avoiding extremes, avoiding scenarios of rising CO2 beyond 700 parts per million in the atmosphere is mandatory for our subsistence and in order not to compromise sustainable development. We see that also in our country. I just mentioned the mega drought that we are experiencing, and this is perfectly aligned with the projections of climate change in the future in terms of drying trends. A massive drying trend will be happening between, I would say, latitudes 30 and 40 south. Along with that, increases in temperature and increases in water consumption via evaporation. So it is a manifestation of what we are seeing right now, and we need to learn about what is to make wise decisions. Action, and our actions have to go in a way in which we mitigate those risks. Adaptation is about reducing the exposure of society, it's about reducing the vulnerability of society, it's about building capacity to mobilize resources and be resilient to these changes. So I'd like to share a bit that long, but I'd like to stress out a couple of relevant ideas. If climate change is a major risk and adaptation is relevant in order to secure our way of living and maintain sustainable courses of development, this is a problem of decision-making. And the problem of decision-making needs to be framed correctly. The first and most important idea perhaps here is that sometimes people see adaptation as an alternative way to mitigation. Either you do one or the other. Countries that have little participation in fossil fuel emissions need to focus on adaptation. Well, let me say something. If we do not transform our economy towards lower use of carbon, hopefully carbon neutral, we will be increasing the risk and adaptation will not be possible. So the first adaptation measure precisely is about mitigating, it's about reducing carbon emissions, having inventories of emissions, protecting carbon sinks. Most of our, this is a figure about greenhouse gas emissions in Chile. Most of our carbon balance depend on forest, either plantations or native forests, along with wetlands and coastal algae, what is called the kelps. This has a capacity that reduces our net emission by 40 or 50%. It's a major stock that we have. And protecting that and increasing that is mandatory in order to achieve carbon neutrality. And like I said, this is the first way to address climate risk and increase adaptation. Second of all, adaptation itself requires to know what are the consequences of climate change. And one of the barriers perhaps for people is understanding what does it really mean to have an increase of temperature or a decrease of precipitation for their day-to-day life or for their particular system. We have done that in Chile. This is a major effort of the research community. It's called to get information about the consequences that climate change may have in different sectors, such as mining, water health, infrastructure for electricity, and so on and so forth. Having knowledge about the consequences is the first step towards developing a nice adaptation plan. Second of all is to frame adaptation in a way in which we handle the dynamics of this process. Climate change will be happening along the way, and it will manifest in a way that perhaps is not anticipated by our models. So we need to understand this as a recursive, dynamic, iterative process in which we are assessing the impacts, exploring alternatives for adaptation, selecting the ones that will perform better, and reconduct this analysis in order to get a robust solution. This is a nice cartoon about what it really means to have the framing of decision making correctly, involve the communities and their perspectives and their values. Of course, these are for perspective that he has is the one that I'm showing on the right side. It's totally different. And policy makers, decision makers, governmental officers, and particular perspective on what are the course of adaptation, what are the needs, what are the best strategies, but incorporating the views, the perceptions, the values, the scale of values of the communities is highly relevant in order to design the solutions. We have explored something like that in a complex process. This is a cartoon, this is a picture, about an adaptation process that we did for the Maipo region. Maipo is the main river that crosses the Santiago, and we focus on water security. But along the way we were doing this project, we realized that there were many objectives that we need to be considered. So objectives means, what are the aims of our adaptation process? Do we want to maintain, for instance, water security? Do we want to increase ecosystem services and well-being of society? Do we need to address inequalities? Those are objectives, functions that come in our decision-making process. Second of all, and this is taken from Chapter 5 in IPCC report on agriculture, the chapter I was working on. It's about assessing what are the real feasible options, the alternatives that we do have for adaptation. So we have an objective, we need to go somewhere. What are the main actions that can be implemented in order to get there? And some of them are, of course, aligned with Sustainable Development Goals. Those are the ones that we would prefer. Some of them are not. Some of them, like Fernanda mentioned, could cause maladaptation processes. So they're diminishing our objective function. We're not achieving the goals that we have set up. But having a portfolio of alternatives is critical for this process. And finally, we need ways to assess what are the contributions, the actual benefits that we capture from the adaptation perspective. This is also a theoretical figure, if you want to call it like that, or conceptual figure, in which we have the benefits of adaptation, how much climate change impacts are reduced, perhaps. This is the level of climate change from 0 to high impacts of climate change. And we see that some options rapidly produce benefits, but at certain level of climate change, they do no longer yield the same benefits, and we need to go further and further. Perhaps some of the first measures are on the tactical side, what we call the incremental adaptation options. Some of them are more system-oriented in a way in which we try to rethink the performance of a particular systems. Perhaps agriculture needs to be reinterpreted, reconfigured, or some of them are more radical and require really transformational approaches. And for all of them, there is a precise moment in time in which these actions can be implemented. Actually, the x-axis that reveals climate change intensity is also a time axis. So we see in the future that climate change will become more and more intense, more and more severe. So we need to really assess the right moment for each particular adaptation portfolio to facilitate the process of adaptation in general and maintain our status of life. Thanks so much, Rocio. Hopefully this has been provoking thoughts for our audience, and I'll be happy to answer questions and participate in the discussion.
Thank you, Francisco, for your wonderful presentation. We already have some questions, so we will start with one for both of you, and it says, in your opinion, you have already mentioned it, but maybe you can expand. Some people think that citizens can do little for adaptation because it matters of institutions, governments, economy, laws, etc. Can we do something as citizens? What do you think about that? So that's an open question for both of you. Maria and Francisco, maybe who would like to start with this? So what can we do as citizens in this situation?
Perhaps it's unpolite to start, so I'm gonna give the possibility to Fernanda to take the first attempt if she wants.
Sorry, I was involuntarily disconnected. The internet falls here, so I'm now connecting by my cell phone.
Oh, I see.
I couldn't hear anything since Francisco presentation. I could not see to the end. So please, if you can repeat the question.
Maria Fernanda, we started with the questions from the audience, and one question was addressed to both of you, and it says that some people think that citizens can do very little for adaptation because it matters more to institutions, governments, economy, laws, etc. So the question was, what can we really do something as citizens? What do you think about that? So maybe in this case, since Maria just came back, Francisco, you can answer something. So we give some time to Maria Fernanda to.
Okay.
To learn. Yeah.
Sure. Then, okay. I think climate change is the responsibilities grow from personal level to perhaps community level and governmental and international. Their share, and my invitation here for most of the people is to first really get a deep understanding on which are the ways in which climate change is affecting their particular lives. It can be very simple. It can be, I have a yard, and my backyard, I usually irrigate my backyard, and it has, 20 square meters, and I know in the future water could be a scarcity problem. So what are the ways in which I can reduce my water consumption and build somewhat certain capacity to adapt to reductions in water? It's a very, very simple thing, and you'll see how things become more and more, but you apply it. Reducing carbon emissions is the first step in terms of adaptation, because it goes directly toward the climate hazards. So again, asking themselves about what are the ways in which you can reduce your use of resources, energy, water. What are the carbon footprint of their activities, and have like an internal competition how to decrease these marks. I asked my children to stick the bill accounts of water and electricity and gas in the free. If we can move the signal a little bit towards the right side, the right direction.
Son las diferentes direcciones.
Thank you. Maria Fernanda, maybe you can say.
Okay. Yeah, I would say that in this subject, we have different topics to discuss here. I guess one thing is that, of course, individual change is part of a collective change. So something is related to the way we behave, our consumption pattern that connects resilience and sustainability since ever. And I really believe, but it's not that scientific, but I really believe, and even because I have worked with sustainability for decades, and I really believe that individual changes are important to promote collective change. And when we are collectively, when we believe in something as a group, or we act like a group, we can even make much more pressure on the change that are needed for us. So it's one aspect. The other aspect is that there are some individual, private, or autonomous adaptation that are very useful and necessary, because we keep thinking of cities. We keep building the cities part by part in the sum of individual initiatives. So the city is very dynamic because people are doing things, building new buildings, or doing their own construction and their own sorry, I have not this word aterro for building. Okay, the thing is that if the city is a collective construction, so if we do our own adaptation, we of course we reduce the unresilient global result. So autonomous adaptation, particular private adaptation, is very important. So you're doing you're reducing the consumption of energy in your house, or using solar panels, or etc. It's important. Or reducing the impermeabilization of your site, etc. But some structural change in the infrastructure, the drainage system, the water supply, the waste system, the transportation, the public transportation system, they are all changes that are completely central to resilience, and and for this we need the government, the local government action, and also we need the laws and programs and everything, and regulation, proper regulation, and even for the private adaptation, for initiatives that are from people, the local government or the government needs to provide the proper regulation. So it's another, to close my speech, for me it's the most important thing here, because this is something we really miss now. Most of cities I have studied for the last 10 years, they don't have proper regulation for building the city in the proper dynamic of the city to guide the private adaptation. So how will people build in a adapted or resilient way if the urban codes are completely mistaken in terms of adapting to climate and etc. So I guess I can have these four main topics here in this issue.
Thank you, Maria Fernanda, for your insights. We have received many questions. Thank you so much to the audience for all the questions. I have to pick some of them, and one is very interesting for both of you. In your opinion, what is the tendency in Latin America? Are the countries focusing more on adaptation or mitigation strategies? What do you think about that? How the countries in Latin America are focusing more on adaptation or mitigation strategies? So who would like to start? Maria Fernanda, maybe this time?
Yeah, okay. It depends on the sector. In general, I guess we invest very little in adaptation at this point. And but one thing, for example, in the transport sector, there is nothing in terms of adaptation and some in terms of mitigation, but nothing in terms of adaptation. In other sectors, it can be a little bit different. But in general, what I would say, and it matches with the video of the first student in Japan, we here also have lots of good plans, good adaptation plans, good mitigation plans in national level, and even in the level of the states, that is the political organization of the republic here in Brazil, and also in local scale. Really good plans, good laws, but very little action connected to this. So I cannot say we are doing much in Brazil and in Latin America in terms of adaptation, either in mitigation, not even in mitigation, because we have good plans, good ideas, good intentions, and very less really done and effective change. So I would say mitigation is something much more advanced in terms of action, but even this is it's not enough for a change. And I would agree with Francisco in the part of I could hear of his presentation that it's really not ideal to treat mitigation and adaptation separately. So I would try to I would insist on this connection to really achieve some effective change.
Thank you, Maria Fernanda. Francisco, some words about the question?
Yeah, I think it's a bit complicated, the question. My first reaction would be that we're far behind in mitigation in Latin America. And this is because it's also a political issue. And let's take Brazil, for example. You change government and you change somehow your political willingness to address certain problems. We will see what's happened with Lula, but we were certain that Bolsonaro wasn't a person that would be willing to commit strongly on mitigation. And I mentioned depends on the sector. Transportation and energy are taking the lead in terms of mitigation, perhaps, because they're the users of fossil fuels, basically. And most of the countries in Latin America are in a stage of understanding impacts rather than designing adaptation and mitigation strategies. So, and the other issue that is complicated with adaptation is that it's very context specific. It's very local. So having a real account of what are the actions that are being implemented is complicated, unless like infrastructure. Like dams, reservoirs, builds is something that occurs at the community level. And we are seeing some adaptation, but Latin America is far behind, I would say, than other countries. The ones that are taking the lead are perhaps Australia, in Europe, of course, Germany, the Netherlands are quite good examples of incorporating adaptation and mitigation policies.
Thank you, Francisco. Unfortunately, we are running out of time, so we will not have more time for the Q&A session. However, we will pass along all the questions that were addressed to the panelists so they can consider them in future presentations. So I really want to thank Jose, Omar, Vicenzo, Cristobal, Marco, also Jose Arturo, Alejandra, who were asking, Carlo. There were many questions, so we are very happy with the reception of the presentations. So be sure that we will pass your questions to the panelists so they can consider them in the future. Now we would like to start closing our webinar today with some final words. So thank you, Maria. Thank you, Francisco, for your wonderful presentations. Please, in a minute, what would you say to end this webinar? Maria, maybe you start.
Okay. So first, I really would love to receive the questions. Really, if you can send me them the questions people made, and I would like to thank you a lot, and actually to say that even if it seems not so hopeful message, everything we are talking here now is very hard actually to hear that we are running to very difficult situations in the future and not doing what's necessary to avoid that, and we it seems like a crazy person acting, because he knows that it's actually it's like he doesn't know what is in the future, and in our case we know what is in the future. So I know it seems a little bit hard to hear and to discuss and to think about, but I really guess we can still do something to change this situation. And as much as we are involved on this, in each way we can do this, will be helpful, I guess, to change the way we are running so fast to this dramatic future. I hope we can still take another way to the future. Thank you very much for the invitation.
Thank you for your thoughts and insights today. Francisco, would you like to close, to say some final words for our webinar today?
Yeah. Sure. Thanks. And I'm following the same cue of Maria Fernanda. This is probably the environmental problem that has the biggest ramifications and like something. And there are bad news, of course, about climate change. Our trajectories are not good. The consequences are quite dramatic, but I believe there is still a lot to do. Had little to do. I think we are, on the contrary, in a place in which we can implement actions for both mitigation and adaptation that are relevant at the personal, community, and governmental level. So an invitation for sustainable development, and all the Sacru members is let us try to document those initiatives and have a repository of actions that are being implemented in Portugal, in Australia, in Chile. This repository could be a source for others that can start implementing actions on adaptation and mitigation. That's my invitation for you. Thanks.
Thank you, Francisco, for your wonderful presentation and insights today. We will hear a final words by Francisco Gallego, Director of the Institute for Sustainable Development of the Pontifical Catholic University of Chile, that has been also joining today's Sacru to organize this webinar. Francisco.
Well, thanks a lot. So on behalf of Sacru, UC Chile, and the Institute for Sustainable Development, I'd like to thank our students, panelists, organizers, and all of the people who join us today for this thought-provoking webinar, I would say. I think the discussions, the different perspectives, and the insights shared today remind us that the challenge we face in terms of climate and more general in sustainability are complex, are multifaceted, but also offer opportunities for innovation and collaboration. I was particularly inspired by the call for action from the students representing cities and countries. The need for cooperation among ourselves within and between countries is more pressing than ever, I think. And it is clear that a systematic approach is needed to address like the socioeconomic and political dimensions and implications of the climate crisis, as Fernanda and Francisco show us with specific examples from the global south, from Brazil and Chile. I think the fight against the climate crisis is also a fight for humanity and for our planet, as the student from Japan said. And we must work together to find like innovative solutions that benefit everyone. And I wouldn't forget about the good news. We heard from the student from Portugal about the increase in the use of renewable energy. Francisco just mentioned different like initiatives that are taking place in different Sacru universities, and he invited us to share and collaborate with these initiatives. And I think these are just two examples of how we can make progress towards a more sustainable future when we work together towards this common goal. So we hope this webinar has inspired us to think more deeply about the role we can play in creating a more sustainable future for all. We look forward to continuing this important conversation and working together to find solutions on sustainability. Thank you very much for being part of this vital conversation. Thanks.
Thank you. Before you leave, please note that the webinar will be uploaded to YouTube so it can be shared and watched at a later time. We would like to extend our gratitude to the professors for their wonderful presentations, for the video as well, and to all the participants for joining us today in the Zoom room. Have a wonderful day.
Thank you. Thank you very much.
Bye-bye.
Bye-bye.